correct? Sorry. Okay, you control it. You turn it on off, right? I don't. Okay. Yeah, yeah. It's perfect. Perfect. Yeah, it's very short.
Yeah.
Hi.
So
Hi.
now I
Yep.
want to show you how to do it.
Oh, remote. Hi. No? He knows to change his camera angle. Did you tell him when we start? Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And do you think we're going to start a few minutes? Yeah. You know, that's fine. That's fine. Do you think we're going to start a few minutes late because everything was late? What do you think? What's your advice? What happened in the opening? It was very late. Like, I thought it was supposed to start at 12. Yeah. Yeah. It's touching my face. Is that okay? Touching the face or pull it out a little? Oh, there's Melchor. Hey. Hi.
Would you like to go to
Yeah.
the stage?
Yeah.
and then-
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he don't have PowerPoint, only speak.
Yeah. Correct. 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 Thank you. Melchor. Hi. 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 Come. I want to draw you into the conversation. So come, make sure. Yeah. And it is. I was so excited to hear you were here. I'm a little sweaty from all the running around. I know. It's good. Sylvia's talk was so good. Yeah. She did such a good job. I thought it was really good. Okay.
You have him as well on that
So
screen.
it's just me sitting up there. It's very lonely. So I'm definitely going to call on you. Yes. Oh my gosh. I wanted, I couldn't create a round table because I didn't know who would be here with the members. But I don't know if they have more chairs. It's very confusing. The program's very confusing. I know. I don't envy them. But maybe, I don't know if we can, yeah. I don't know if you can see us. Can you see us? So I think we might start a little late. Or maybe it's just going to be a very small round table. But I might invite you. Let me ask them if they have another mic. But they have handheld mics, so you can just come and sit there. No, no, I'm going to do it as a conversation. I really want. Okay, so I think. Really, that's awesome. Okay, yeah, okay, okay. Wow. All right, I should go set up and turn off my phone. Let me just do that.
Good morning, Anjali.
Hi, hi. How are you? I don't know if you can see
Good.
me.
How are you?
A little sweaty, but good. Melchor is here, which is really cool.
Oh, hi, Melchor.
And I'm so hi to you too. Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to be here in Barcelona and to be joining the global dialogue about the transformation in higher education needed for the world. We have the 2030 goals in our mind, but even 2050 to inspire us. But there's a lot to figure out along the way. And today, we're kicking off with the next hour and 25 minutes. We want to use the moment to construct a conversation with all of you. What we're going to do today is to make sense of what we've been learning in our work at MIT, and I'm about to describe that. I have a colleague who's going to join me from the Boston area, and we're going to kick it off with an interactive conversation that draws all of you in. And I am beyond thrilled that we have two of our esteemed collaborators in the room, and who knows, maybe some more will arrive, who will also talk about working with us at MIT's JWEL. So let me explain what that all is. So here's the setup for our conversation. We've been asked a lot to, obviously, the whole world has asked higher education to go online, and MIT, in many ways, has led that transformation for a group of its own collaborators and for its own students and those with whom it works. But we wanted to cast an even wider net in the conversation today to ask, what are we learning about navigating digital disruption? This is a question that UNESCO put to us. So we've been thinking hard about what that might mean. And the way we decided to frame today's talk, today's conversation, is to talk not just about where we want to get to, but what the journey there looks like. I think it's a really interesting question. Everyone will agree we need to figure out how to do better in delivering digital education, whether it's on campus, whether it's remote, whether it's a blend. And I think we have varying opinions about what the end state should look like, but anyone who's experienced in any field will tell you we're never done. It's always a journey. We think there's some really interesting questions to sort out about how we get where we want to go and what the different pathways might look like. And I'll introduce our my collaborator in just a moment, but let me tell you who I am. My name is Anjali Sastry. I have taught at MIT. I joined the faculty at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in 2001, so it's been a while. And I have joined the staff at the Abdul Latif Jameel World Education Lab in the past few months. And I'm really thrilled to be engaging with you here today, hopefully with our current members and maybe even future members. And we'll tell you more about JWEL in just a moment. So my colleague is Vijay Kumar. He's the executive director of JWEL, and I'll draw him in just a moment. So I'll open with a few comments about JWEL and the place we're situated, which is open learning at MIT. And then I'll draw in Vijay. I have questions, there he is, prepared for him. And then I have questions for all of us to discuss. And please, come on down. We definitely want to hear from you. And JWEL members, I don't know you all by sight, so if you're a member, I'm definitely hoping you will jump in the conversation. Let me go back to my slides. I'm not sure how to... Okay, I'm going to show you. I have only a couple of slides, but here's the setup. So, across the MIT ecosystem, where I've both been a student in the 80s and the 90s. I got my PhD there and joined the faculty, as I said, in 2001. We see myriad opportunities with every day. People starting up new businesses, people discovering new things in labs, faculty trying new experiments, people working in the field, people building new models. It's pretty inspiring. And we do know that MIT has been really investing in figuring out how to teach better. And I think that's been a lifelong goal of any faculty who joins MIT, but we've really doubled down our investment in learning how to teach better. And that started with investments in things like Centers for Teaching and Learning and Research, but about a decade ago, we formed MIT Open Learning. And Open Learning is an umbrella organization that draws together MITx, which is our online course system, and many great MOOCs are hosted out of MITx, as well as Open Learning, which recently celebrated 20 years of existence. And if you don't know OCW, if you don't know Open Courseware, OCW, go check it out. We've put every course that MIT has taught is available online. All my courses are there, teaching materials, assignments, even samples of student work. So we have thrown open the portals to the sort of back end of MIT teaching through OCW. Open Learning hosts many other innovative efforts that include reaching out to companies that package and present MIT materials in new ways, that innovate in delivering education to refugees, that are constantly seeking for new ways to kind of take what we've done and the investments we've made within MIT out to the world. But JWEL is particularly special because the name of it is World Education Lab. I felt like we should be here and talking to you about what we've learned, but also asking you, what do you want us to focus on? What do you think are the really important things to put on the agenda today? And JWEL has led in a variety of ways, but always looking at 3 legs and linking them together: K through 12 education, higher education, and workplace education. And we exist as a sort of a portal. That's part of our function, is to say what's happening at MIT that we can bring to the world. And when we launched almost 5 years ago, the idea was we would build a membership model. And our members join us in order to both learn from and contribute to their work in educational innovation. We recently stepped back to look at everything we're doing, and we see our center of mass is in higher education. It doesn't mean we don't care about the other sectors, but we're actually really interested in how we leverage our center of mass in higher education to go out and reach K through 12 through to workforce learning for the entire life period. And we have colleagues here today who are doing this in really cool new ways. I'm really excited to be able to draw them in. Okay, so that's my thumbnail introduction to JWEL. I'd like to invite my colleague, Vijay Kumar, to say what he would add to that picture to give you a thumbnail sketch of what JWEL is and what open learning is. Go for it, Vijay, please.
You there, and it's just a pleasure to join you all, even if virtually. A special hello to some of our members who are sitting on the table over there. Wish I could be there, but this actually, in some sense, illuminates the modality that we're all walking into as a general practice, the blended, collaborative way of engagement. I don't have much to add. I think Anjali set the stage very well. We have a mission at the Jameel World Education Lab, which says it is there to spark a global renaissance in education. We'd like to say learning. And what we have seen, this is our 5th year in existence. What we have become, and through the collaborators that we have, the work that we are drawing upon at MIT, increasingly we are becoming a visible and viable platform for educational change. There are a couple of things that are so germane to this particular gathering. We do, as Anjali pointed out, and in the slide that she showed, we draw upon some things that are distinctively MIT education, that characterize MIT education, rigor, bringing the joy, the tools, the practice of research into thinking about higher education in particular, thinking about active learning, minds-on, hands-on education. Those are what we think are some of the invariants of quality that characterize learning at MIT, and we want to extend that to influence good practice elsewhere. But there's this other dimension that Anjali referred to, which is reflected in Open Learning's work, which is really, and across MIT too, which is really about relentless innovation, always starting off with ourselves as a subject, actually, to say, how can we employ new modalities, new technologies, move those inventions into the educational innovation space so we can actually bring better quality to learning, and more importantly, or as importantly, extend what we are learning through these innovative practices to co-construct solutions for others in the world. The thing that JWell's Open Learning and JWell's launch actually reflects something very, very important. Part of it was just observing what was going around in the world around us, and part of it was reactive. A lot of it was anticipatory, saying, look, technology is becoming increasingly central. Like Anjali, I have been at MIT for 26 years, and we have seen a variety of applications of education technology, but largely to improve what we are doing on site. And now what we started witnessing was the increasing centrality of technology, of digital in learning practice. Meanwhile, what we also observed was how it was changing the workplace, how it was changing the economy, and even more importantly, how there was a significant need, a very, very loud need, voluble need, to meet the needs of unmet needs of learners. And that population was growing differently. It was not just people who had been traditionally underserved, but through a variety of social, economic, political factors, the population of underserved learners was increasing. In fact, if anything, COVID pointed out these fault lines and made them very, very visible. And we said that here it was not just an opportunity, but there was a significant need to address these growing unmet needs, learning needs. This growing population of people who needed to have learning opportunities, different kinds of learning opportunities.
Great.
So with these two factors, the fact that technology was becoming increasingly central, the fact that there's this whole group of people with new learning needs, whose needs had to be met, we launched the Jameel World Education Lab, and saying that we will draw upon what we know is what we have learned at MIT from pedagogical innovation and research.
Great.
And construct solutions for everybody.
Great. So in doing that, what we've done is talk to higher education institutions all over the world, worked hard to listen to them, but also to connect to innovations that our own faculty and staff are trying out, and to be very mindful of exactly those investments, resources, and assets that Vijay just mentioned. If we're already investing in online learning at MIT, or we're playing with hybrid learning, how do we bring that to others? I am so thrilled that you're here, but also in particular that we have members here. And I have two that I'm going to ask to say hello in a moment, but is there anyone else in the room who is a JWell member? Not yet, we should just say, because I know there are folks here. Sylvia Schmenke had been at Iberoamericano in Mexico City, and they're a member. And also I know folks from Sharjah are here in UAE, and we're hunting for more. It's been a little hard to just connect on who's here in situ, but I'm going to make sure to connect as many people as possible in this session and afterwards. And I'll share an email address at the end that you can ping me, and we will follow up and make connections right away. So can we say hi to our two members? And we have a mic. Could you introduce yourselves and say a little bit about how you've used your JWell membership? Because that'll give us some really important context. I know there's another mic, but tell us who you are and how you've worked with JWell. stand up so we can
Okay.
see you and turn around. I'm
Yeah,
so excited.
so-
Right here in Barcelona, we are being represented.
So thank you very much, Anjali and Vijay. Thank you all for being here. So my name is Pastora Martinez Samper. I'm Vice President for the Open University here in Catalonia. And yeah, we're part of the GWEL for a long time now. And yeah, so what we're doing there, you must know that the UOC, or the WOC, as we call it here, is a fully online university. So we were created just 2 years after the World Wide Web went public. So we are just like this.
Digital
so
natives.
Yeah.
That's what we call you.
Yeah, the digital natives. But you must know also that our students are non-traditional learners.
Yeah.
So in that sense, for all, the pathways of lifelong learning are very important, and this is something that we are trying to disrupt, and we will talk about disruption right now, but disrupt within the university and in collaboration with MIT, the UNAM, and others. No? How do we create different ways of innovative formats that Vijay was mentioning in order to help our lifelong learners, non-traditional learners, to go through what they need whenever they need it, and with the different methodologies and so on.
Excellent. That's great. And we'll hear more from you throughout the conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Pastora.
Okay, hello. I am Melchor
Great.
Sanchez.
I'm so excited.
I am not so excited. I'm scared. Okay, so can we
Just
improvise?
say who you are and tell us
Okay,
your...
I'm Melchor Sanchez. I'm a physician, a pediatrician. I work in Mexico City, in the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I am a professor of the medical education and the Faculty of Medicine. Currently, I have the position, not very enviable position of being in charge of distance education and educational assessment in our university. Maybe some of you haven't heard about UNAM. UNAM is this huge, monstrous, complex animal. We have more than 360,000 students, more than 41,000 faculty. We have campuses all over the place in Mexico City and several countries. And I mean, during the pandemic, we have been doing whatever we can with the resources we have. Fortunately, I am a fan, a complete believer of online education. I did a master's in education completely online, so I am sold on the concept.
Yeah.
And I know that the emergency remote teaching that we lived during the pandemic in Mexico and all over the world was not the ideal online quality education. So,
Yeah.
well, when we heard about GWEL, and because I trained at MIT in the 90s for 3 years in my research training, so I used to, I didn't associate the word MIT with education. I used to associate MIT with technology, engineering, etc.
You learned by doing, because you were a researcher who learned by joining a lab and leading research, right, at MIT.
And I love the MIT culture, this culture of openness, of sharing, which is completely different from Harvard. Sorry, I don't know if there's some, or other universities that they are like these classmates that do not want you to copy you to let you see their homework. So, I mean, so we became members of the GWEL lab, and it has been a great experience the last couple of years because we have shared with many universities from all over the world our successes, if we can call it that, and some of our failures, because one of the arguments of confronting disruption, is that you have to recognize your failures, to be humble. The pandemic, if there is something that really has taught us how to be humble, has been the pandemic. So there are a lot of things to do.
That's a really good introduction.
So that's about it.
And let me sing, why don't you keep the mic, because I'm going to weave this in. A cool thing that Melchor didn't mention is he walks the talk. So he's taking online courses now. And you and your whole team have been taking courses and then using that to reflect on and innovate in distance education and digital education. So I think it's a testimony to lifelong learning right there. So I want to frame two themes related to digital disruption. So the first is the aim of going for digital disruption, the goal of saying we are going to create something innovative and go and disrupt education. And then I want to turn to a second part, which will resonate for a lot of us, which is the sort of response and adaptation to what we are being asked to do in a hurry. And that's maybe sort of the uncontrolled or emergent transformation. But I want to ask, I'm going to ask Vijay first, but when you launched JWell, did you actually sit down and think we are sort of proactively, we're going to create digital transformation in the world? How did you see that kind of forward-looking creation of disruptive transformation when you launched JWell 5 years ago?
Wow, that's a very good question. It's also really good for the context that Professor and Melchior set. We set out not to say we're going to change the world, but say, look, there are opportunities and problems and unmet needs that need to be addressed. So there are some hard problems of education, and part of this is actually in the continuum. Anjali, you made a reference to OpenCourseware, for instance, and the intent was to really say, how can we share our learning, our pedagogy more widely with the world? And I will take a little page from history for a second. At that time, there were various universities who were launching, sort of commercial ventures for content, etc. And our faculty at MIT said, look, and our president at that time said, look, here are these people who are doing things with the internet, commercializing their content, etc. Did we miss the boat?
Yeah.
So you're talking
about Coursera being launched and us?
No, this was this was even before. This is circa 2000, 1999. Yeah. When Fathom was launched and Fathom was launched, Columbia, UNEX, there were various initiatives. And then there were other universities, Chicago, Stanford, etc. Yeah. And our faculty said, look, in order for us, what we do, and some of it was touched in your slides also, our quality of quote unquote excellence is derived from a very high bandwidth of interaction between great students and great faculty. We bring this, the practice, joy, and tools of research. We have active learning. This is how we characterize good learning. And at that time, we only knew how to, and we believed, with all our humility, or our faculty believed, that we knew only how to do that only on-site, right, face-to-face learning. Mm-hmm. And we said the most honest thing we can do at that time to keep up our aspiration of sharing and influencing the world would be to take a picture of it and share that widely. That was OpenCourseware. Yeah. Then we move on to around when edX and open learning is launched, and we said, no, we have learned a thing or two about online education, about digital writ large. Yeah. Digital was not just taking the practice that we're doing and popping it online, but saying there's AR, VR, there's online, there's edX. We have learned a thing or two about online and how can we bring what we are learning, and we are also experimenting coming out of the task force at MIT. How can we share that? What is a vehicle of sharing that more extensively and building capabilities and capacity elsewhere? Okay. And that's how JWell was launched. Okay. So that was the...
Cool. Let me jump in there, though, and flag a couple of things Vijay said in case you want to learn more. In 2013, 2014, MIT launched a task force to look at the future of education at MIT. And that task force was a pretty deep report that drew on faculty, staff, alums, and others. And you can go online and see it and borrow ideas from it or, scoff at it. But you'll also see in there, we have sort of sown the seeds of some of the things that followed. And so looking back in time, you can tell one of those just so stories where, we saw the future, we had a task force, we wrote a report, we made it so. And it's a little hubristic, I think, to overclaim on that front, and yet without setting forth a big goal, how do we get somewhere? And at MIT and maybe many other universities, I certainly know from my recent visit to UNAM that you see that happening there too. We always have a mix. We have grandiose statements. Sometimes we can sort of swing into action and enable them, and with the right moment in history and the right funds, the leaders can kind of make that happen. And sometimes we make a guess, and we're lucky enough that an opportunity arrives and we can hitch onto it. And sometimes we kind of label the thing that happened and claim it for ours. Any good leader does that too. And we see the seeds of an innovation that we think has had a big impact from MIT, which is the MicroMasters program. I don't know how many of you have heard about this, but students can stitch together a preset sequence of very rigorous MOOC courses. It's not a full, undergrad degree's worth, but it's a deep dive that's carefully designed, extremely rigorous, and extremely well tested and vetted. And if you do well enough in one of these MicroMasters, the first one we launched was on supply chain management, logistics, you can then use it. And one of our negotiations and our sort of learnings and discussions has been, how does that parlay into other opportunities for students? How does a MicroMasters get you somewhere? Would companies hire based on a great MicroMasters performance? Yes. Would you get admission to further education on the basis of that? We decided to test our own model. So MIT now admits, I think we've admitted several hundred students on the basis of MicroMasters, their MOOC performance alone, nothing else. So we don't look at other credentials. They're admitted solely through that particular pathway. And I just finished teaching. Grades were due last Friday, and I had 2 students in my class who joined MIT solely through their MicroMasters credential, and they enriched the class. I had a student from Indonesia who we may not have seen otherwise. Super cool to be able, and we benefit. I mean, this is the great thing about the job I have. I get to benefit from folks coming in the door. And in this case, we had extremely rich and great classroom discussions enabled by the digital portal into MIT proper. But that's not particularly scalable. And that was, in some ways, maybe lucky, maybe extreme foresight by Vijay, the Vice President for Open Learning, Sanjay Sarma, and others at MIT who enabled the MicroMasters, perhaps. But there are other things we are doing that are more happenstance. So I think that's a really interesting question to think about. If we talk about navigating digital disruption, are we the agents and creators of that disruption, or are we the ones responding to that? And where's the locus of the disruption? Is it our own faculty? Sometimes the story we just heard from Vijay at JWell's founding puts faculty in the picture there. Sometimes not so much. I mean, higher ed is rightfully also asking what are companies doing? What are ed tech companies doing? Where are they sources, the sort of impetus for digital transformation? This might be a good moment to both get more thoughts from Vijay, but anyone in the room who wants to add, I don't know, a thought that might be relevant to this question. Do we talk as if we can create digital disruption sitting inside higher ed? How far can we go? What are we learning about that kind of tension between responding to and actually enabling? Vijay, do you want to jump in?
Sure. And you touched on some very important things, Anjali, and starting from, you used some terms that, we can, you mentioned disruption a few times, you mentioned scale, and I know, knowing you, that you don't do things accidentally. There's intent, and you also mentioned how much of this is, sort of our foresight and our, so one of the things, you hear me say this all the time, and then you also sort of invoked, when you talked about industry, the notion of the ecosystem. So you heard me say that, look, my preparation is as a futurist in education. That's what my PhD was. And one of the things we always say is that the business of a futurist is to co-construct preferred futures with others, not to predict the future. So prediction is sort of out. But there is one thing, and I'll pick up from, I'm familiar with WALK for a long time, Pasteur has said, and she used the term non-traditional learners. And one of the things that we have seen is that the sort of the numbers and the types of non-traditional learners is becoming non-traditional. We used to glibly say, oh, those are the millennials, and suddenly we find that no, non-traditional learners come in all shapes and forms. They are vocationally displaced learners, locationally displaced learners, situationally displaced learners, along with this whole new generation of the millennials. All that is there. But we also, I think the fact is, when we talk with our collaborators, our members, one of the things that becomes apparent is that they say, look, it's insanity when we try to apply the same techniques, the same modalities to address this new set of problems, because there's no traction. It's like doing the same thing and expecting different results. So traditional solutions, and I'm going to extremely characterize it as brick and mortar solutions, traditional ways of constructing learning, delivering learning is just not going to cut it to meet the scale, as you pointed out, where scale is not just taking what you have and delivering it to the millions, the McDonald metrics, but to recognize that scale is a vector, that there are different kinds of learners, differentiated learners who have different modalities. And therefore, we had to come up with innovative solutions and in order to address these new needs. And these innovative solutions are not all that we have predetermined or imagined. We only know what we know, but we are willing. So that's the most important dimension of this, being open and receptive to creating new solutions with our collaborators.
But that calls for what Melchior opened with. You have to then tell the stories honestly, including the failure stories. A philosopher once said, we live life forward but make sense of it backwards, and we know all about hindsight bias. We are prone to tell stories that get us to where we are today, that cast us in good light. And I think that's a huge issue here when we look at navigating digital disruption, whether we're responding to it or trying to enact it. This is a fraught journey because the needs are so high, and the scale and pace of change required seems so daunting. So we'd better get smarter about telling the story about what works and what doesn't and why. We have a comment from the audience. I think there's another mic somewhere. Do we know where the second mic is, folks? Thank you. This gentleman here in the blue shirt would like to make a comment. Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah, many thanks. I'm Thomas Jørgensen from the European University Association. And it might be a little bit of a European perspective on this, because we do discuss the digital disruption and transition through all the whole legal framework that's being set up in Europe. And I think, sure, universities can do the disruptions, but it also requires some questions that we need to respond to as a sector, and that are difficult to respond to. And in Europe, the discourse is very much about how do we retain control.
Yeah.
And it's bigger than just digitally enhanced learning and teaching.
Interesting.
But what are the data we collect out of this? Who gets access to that data? Is it the students that own the data? Do we own the data? Are the data, is it going to flow freely? Are we going to, make our data from digital education help private providers?
And when you say data, what do you mean? Do you mean performance, or what do you mean?
That could be, that's a question. That could be performance. That could be, people that take this course, will they take that course? What are their trajectory? But you could imagine anything.
Yeah.
You could imagine emotion tracking.
Yeah.
So this is not something I invented. In the education technology, you say, it could be great if we could track emotional responses. Yeah. And technology-wise, we can do that because they are in front of the camera, and that would help our
Yeah.
teaching. But do we want to do that? And if we do that, who owns that? Who owns that data? And what are the privacy concerns, et cetera, et cetera?
And think of this issue. If MIT is going to use a MOOC as criteria for admission, we've worked pretty hard on the back end of that technology to ensure no cheating. But to ensure no cheating means we're stepping into this domain you're discussing
Yeah.
of how much data are we getting. Of course, we work really hard to do this ethically, correctly, and in ways that can't easily be led astray. But yet.
But do you speak to your colleagues and neighbors from other institutions about what is the responsible way of doing this? Because you might do it correctly, but other institutions might have other they're trade-offs. It's not black and white, and they might implement those trade-offs in different ways.
Yeah, so one place in which this is being kind of unpacked and investigated is in looking at credentials. So MIT is a leader of the Digital Credentials Consortium for Education, and that's one domain in which we have definitely wrestled both as an institution but also as a collective to think about what does this entail. I don't know, Vijay, if you want to add any
Yes,
thoughts
no,
on that.
I think you almost plucked the DCC example, but I think this is the point that were made on the floor is extremely important. And there are two things. One, which we'll come back to later, I heard the term digital enhancement. And I just want to circulate the notion that we are talking about disruption, which is of a different flavor than mere enhancement. But we'll come back to that. There's issues of provenance, privacy are extremely important, and we don't know, they'll be surfacing, they'll have to be addressed. But not to sound Pollyannish, but also take comfort that when OpenCourseware the implication of this, there are some very, very serious policy issues. And if we think about the profound kinds of changes that we anticipate and that we want in order to address the original problem of scale and quality, we have to address these. And it's not just with the technology, it's around policy frameworks, et cetera. And that's why it's so important to have gatherings like this. However, where I take comfort is when the whole open movement started, when OpenCourseware was launched, many of these issues around legality, ownership surfaced, things that we had not anticipated. And you saw the Creative Commons movement, legal regiments that were launched, etc. Policy discussions at UNESCO. I was there at that meeting that were launched. So it is important to think about. One more thing, I'll just put it out there, Anjali, which is, and I think you picked up on that when you talked about data, because we also have to think about, there's a lot of focus on data at the micro level, analytics, performance improvement, but data at a macro level, where you say, how do we reconstruct this whole learning environment in order to serve online learners better is an important area, which will have even more issues around privacy and provenance that will have to be addressed.
Okay, let me add a couple of thoughts. First of all, it's not like we've solved the problem. We often look to Europe, especially on privacy issues and other. So let's not pretend that America has got it right yet. We got a lot to learn about, especially about these data questions that are so core. I think that's really, and another thing that was sparked by your response, Vijay, is I was at the roundtable this morning it was so interesting to hear. I've known, of course, Open University in the UK has existed for many decades, but it reminded me when I was a kid in school, a teenager in England actually, I took a correspondence course to better my Hindi because my father is from India. And it was one of those correspondence courses where you get some bad copy of something that's folded up and it comes in the post and you have to fill it out and send it back. So I was thinking about the long roots and depth of sort of the open education movement. Let's not pretend it was all launched, this century, but also think about some of those. I mean, a lot of what I think we've labeled as open is actually a one-way flow, like opening the doors of, opening an OCW, or putting our stuff out there. And in the opening ceremony speeches, I was thinking a bit about what I heard from Professor Schmelke, saying you got to think about two-way flow as well. You know, the future of open is not a one-way flow. I wonder, Pastora, if you have thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I will connect with Thomas' comment because I think that now we are, not just because of the pandemic, but also thanks to the pandemic, we are in a new, I don't know, like call it second open movement, no? And we have also all this open science movement that also UNESCO had made some recommendations for. But it is true that we need, I think, different levels of discussion. Because Thomas was mentioning the European context, you were mentioning the American one. So I think we need this macro global conversation and also the individual one, which is what we are actually making at the GWEL, learning from each other as individual organization. But also, we also need the meso, no? We need this discussion at the European level because we have many, many regulations, more than I think you have in the States, and so on. So I think the context make a situated conversation, learning from each other, but also try to disrupt what our funders and regulators also. Yeah.
We were encouraged this morning to be disruptive and to challenge norms and inertia, I guess. But I think countervailing pressures include those to preserve the disciplines and the rightful place of inertia in maintaining scholarship and academic perspectives, as well as these really important new inertial forces for looking at rights, for looking at privacy, for looking at equity. They might slow us down in the kind of rush to try lots of different things. I also wonder if higher ed is good enough at learning from digital disruption in other domains. I've also done work in healthcare where you see a very strong open learning movement. And that often is peer-to-peer and bypasses educational institutions entirely. You know, ER docs, for example, they have a very vibrant, open, like critical medicine, casualty, emergency medicine community. And that whole, I mean, I don't need to tell you guys this, but all, you know, those one-page tweets that summarize published papers, opening up research that way. Melchior, I wonder if that strikes you as you're both a medical expert and leading this massive campus in looking at digital and distance education. What do you see as big, I don't know, exciting developments or causes for concern? Any thoughts?
Yes, well, I think that one of the major challenges that we have lived like forever is this artificial dichotomy between technology and everything else, including pedagogy. So, and then we focus on this pedagogical or technological determinism, which usually restricts how you view things. So probably a more entangled model of mixing, but thoughtfully, insightfully, with deep metacognition to really transform how we approach technology. So, and the problem is that, in the health sciences, we have all these beautiful vaccines that are very useful, but they are not available for many countries in the world.
Right.
So we had technology that creates something that is very useful for humanity, and then we have this ugly reality that we do not have the vaccines. And the countries that have the vaccines, like yours, people do not want to use the vaccine for the behavioral, sociological, psychological reasons. So there's this whole separation of technology and the use in education that we should really try to focus more on.
Melchior, that's fascinating. You're saying if we want to look at a holistic view of the benefits of being open, is it academia's responsibility to look at the end products that come out of our research enterprise and ensure that they are accessible, not just the learning, but even the new vaccine or the new technology or the new robot or the new AI or whatever it is? Is that what you're arguing?
Yes, well, the thing is that there's this tension, for example, in the field of learning analytics.
Yeah.
We have all these computer scientists and very profound statistical thinkers and mathematicians, and you have on this side educators and people that are in the trenches of education, and it's very difficult to have them talk to each other and understand themselves, and because we have all these different contexts in all countries, the legal issues, the access to data, etc. It's not easy. So I think that we really should question our assumptions. For example, in the inauguration a couple of hours ago, I mean, we're in this beautiful, modern higher education meeting. But the first rows in the auditorium were reserved for the powerful political people. And these guys, they came with all the entourage of people. They sat down, they said their speeches, some good, some not so good, and then they left. And they said, have a fruitful, I mean, they should stay here and because
think about that
even
a
if
lot.
you
Right.
discover a lot of things, it's up to all levels of government and society to really push for things to be applied. Because I was wondering, what is the message for the young people to have all these seats reserved for the powerful people? That's so, I mean, old-fashioned.
It's such an interesting question. I thought about that too. I looked for a global survey of how university students feel about, let's say, the SDGs is what I actually searched for. It's quite hard to find. We know the voice of the students is not even visible. We actually have, thanks to UNICEF, we have some new data coming in from K through 12, global surveys of student attitudes and what they want from learning. We actually have, I couldn't find any systematic global surveys of university students. So even that, like, where's the voice of the students, either symbolically, but even sort of technically? Like, where are we getting? And I think I know as a faculty, I'm often very loath to ask students what they want, because they're gonna tell me they want some impossible mix, you know, of less work and more content or whatever, you know, something like you cannot possibly deliver in one package. You know, they want fewer hassles, but they want more fun, and yet they want depth and so on. So it's hard to ask students, but in many countries, students don't wait to be asked. In your own university, for instance, for gender equity, there was a very strong movement that has prompted change across your campus, where women were demonstrating about their lack of inclusion, and that has led to real curriculum reforms. So I do think about that. How are we actually getting the voice of students properly at the table? How are we getting everyone at the table? Clearly, with digital, we should be. But the question you raised, Melchior, is one that Vijay and I had actually prefigured would come in. We wanted to ask, what's so special about digital? And you're sort of prompting us to think over the sort of life cycle. I don't know if Vijay, you want to add any thoughts to that?
Indeed, indeed. And as always, Melchior just put his finger on the central, but it was wonderfully stated and perhaps better than you and I had originally conceived it. And I'm going to pick up from that and make a couple of comments on that, because it goes to the root of the term that you and I talked about, Anjali, about disruption. So Melchior, you mentioned technological and pedagogical determinism. And I interpret that as indicating the perceived immutability of existing structural relationships, number one.
Okay.
Two, the generalizability of solutions in a context-blind way.
Yep.
And they're both challengeable propositions. Yeah. And the thing is, when we talk about digital disruption, or what is different about digital, it is a fact that all these assumptions are challengeable and, in fact, prone to innovation. Everything from lectures to credentials. Anjali already gave examples. And for instance, in the early days, and this started off with the open movement itself, you made a reference to Open University, Anjali. Sir John Daniels, when he was Vice Chancellor of the Open University, and he was a leader with open education, he talked about the iron triangle, the immutable relationship that we assumed between access, cost, and quality. And he said, look, and the assumption was that if you had great access, quality would suffer. If you had great quality, cost would become just disproportionately crazy. And what we said, open provides the opportunity of making the triangle mutable. You can have indeed great access without sacrificing quality, and great quality, not necessarily at great cost. In a similar fashion, what digital is doing, and the MicroMaster is saying, look, it is challenging the existing structural relationship between the learner and the institution, between credentials and admissions and institutions. The MicroMasters example that Anjali referred to is a vivid example. What you're really saying is that, look, you don't have to get admitted to learn only if you want a particular kind of credential. And now you have variety. You can get the online one, or you can do this other stuff to get a terminal one at an institution. You have disaggregated the relationship between credentials and institution. And it's these kinds of structural disruptions, that changes, that we call being disruptive. And one last point, and I think both of you really talked about it very nicely. I mean, and Anjali, you and Melto, you're talking about questioning assumptions, and that is almost like having an introspective openness. And you've heard me say this a million times. I believe that the only persistent benefit that technology, in this case, read digital, brings to any enterprise is the opportunity to look at how you were doing things in the first place. And so the biggest opportunity over here in terms of what is different about digital is that it is really allowing us to think about the interaction of learner, about conceptual knowledge, how different kinds of learners learn, what we were doing that was so short-sighted, or that we couldn't address needs of different populations, and the fact that learning was not continuous, it was limited to 4-year timeframes and 3-year timeframes. And I think that's the opportunity. What is different is it is allowing us to look at what we were doing and seeing what we need to attend to do it differently.
So I would say it's giving us that opportunity, but there's no guarantee we do that. For another person, it's just yet another demand on their time. Like, now I got to teach in this way as well. So sure, on a good day, it's giving us the scope to be introspective, to learn, to build on what we've done. On a bad day, it's just more things on the to-do list that we sort of struggle through. So, there are some interesting elements that come to mind from my own personal experience. After OCW at MIT launched, which was simply putting the courses online, we're talking about the teaching materials. And the vision was this would go to instructors, right? We didn't realize they would be so-called self-learners, or is that what they call it? Individuals teaching themselves. But we launched another version called, as an add-on to OCW, called OCW Educator. And in that, we had faculty reflect on their teaching, because that's occasioned by putting it online. You realize, I haven't explained everything, or I haven't talked about what I think works and why, because no one's ever asked me to. They just look at my evaluations, right, as an instructor. That's what matters. So that was interesting. I wrote tens of thousands of words for each of my courses, because I'm a bit verbose sometimes, but I was also super inspired by thinking and by the questions that the team came up with in order to try to make the material accessible. So I guess I'm both backing up your point, but also saying that's the luxury of those of us who have time and colleagues and the wherewithal to be reflective in this way, putting stuff online, thinking about digital models for teaching, gets us to look at teaching and learning in a new mode. I want to note a couple of things and make sure to really open up the discussion. But we have just jumped into online teaching or digital learning. We haven't talked about things like the back-end stuff of a university, how it works, how it archives its materials. You might have hinted at that in terms of data, because part of this is also how we track students. But universities are struggling with digitalization writ large, not just online teaching, but everything required to make the university truly digital in its strategy. And if for-profit companies are struggling with that transformation, what are the lessons for higher education? Can we get efficiencies? Every day at MIT, someone complains, often it's me, about silly little things, like the back-end process required to book a conference room or whatever. It's like needless friction often exists inside our institutions, and higher education is particularly prone, I think, to inefficiencies that can be hard to unwind. I looked at our group. We have a team at MIT, a center that looks at digital strategy, starting with banks and manufacturers and others. Surely there's massive scope to take the lessons learned from scholars of digitalization and digital strategy and apply them to thinking carefully about the whole digital transformation that universities need. And I think WAC has been also looking at how to draw together disparate faculties and disparate groups and different research groups, and how to blend the physical and the research. Do you want to say a word or two on that, Pastora?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we try to foster interdisciplinary research, and also learning is not that easy to make everybody work together. First of all, to understand each other, to have a common language, and then to look for common questions or things to go there. So what we are now trying to do is, how do we get together, and when do we decide to use both the digital and the face-to-face spaces in order to foster all this debate? And in that sense, if I may add to your previous comment, the main difference I've seen all those years working at the UOC, but also helping other institutions that want to make this digital transformation, higher education institutions, is how, at least in our university, both the academic staff and administrative staff should work all together. So how transversal this work should be in order to create this change within the organization in order to be digital. And this, for me, is the main point, to be aware you want to make this change.
Yeah, I think we have to take that seriously. Okay, so here's like a final question that I'd love everyone's thoughts on. How does the pathway matter? So I am a systems researcher originally, and it was really, there's a whole, there's a lively debate in many fields on the theory of path dependence. Do your early steps constrain or shape what you can do next? And policymakers often have this debate, right? Do we set the policy first and then ensure that what follows adheres to the policy? And in things like privacy and human rights, it's incredibly important, because it's very hard to, as we're seeing right now with big tech, it's hard to retrofit, good design into complex systems. On the other hand, maybe it's crazy to think that one can sit down and imagine what you would want and design it ex ante. And that calls for learning from mistakes and learning as you go. But I think we have a very impoverished language around the sequence, the steps, what you do first, maybe as an institution, maybe as a country, maybe as a governing body of some sort, can set the stage for what happens next. And in fact, if you listen to Vijay's story even about how MIT has evolved in its digital work, it's that the earlier work enabled the subsequent work. It's, again, the story we like to tell because it all makes sense. But if that's the case, how do we make wise decisions today that enable us to build a foundation for tomorrow? And let's not believe that only the folks at the top know what that is. So I think that maybe we need a new complex systems sort of research angle into thinking about path dependence when we look at digitalization. But you could imagine a contested domain for credentials for policies around privacy. Maybe for the platform owners, that's actually happening when you look at the MOOC platforms, right? There's a debate, there's a market struggle for who gets to win in that space. Maybe there's also, though, the formation of beliefs about how we learn online, how we benefit. I mean, on a good day, this seems like it's a candy store. We have so many options when we look at combining digital and real world. But on the flip side, are we locking into place things that are harder to change later? And how do we even know? I welcome any thoughts from any of you on this. There's a hand up over there. Can we move the mic? Thank you. Thanks for your help. A little bit of running. Thank you. So it's asking about sequence and pathways. And what are our questions, and maybe what are some potential models for figuring that out? Please.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Diana Alazar. I work with Minerva Project. It's a company based in the US that actually partners with universities to do exactly that, digital disruption, although we like to call it reform, because we don't start with technology. As the gentleman said, it's really about pedagogical reform, it's about curricular reform, interdisciplinarity, assessment reform, and yes, technology can be a tool to help all of that. Yeah. So maybe to your question, what we've seen, we've partnered with universities in many places, and where we've seen them succeed is when they've created a separate entity, whether it's a college within the university, a program within a division, from scratch to exactly created kind of hybrid or digitally first, and then maybe expand it to become the DNA of the rest of the university. Because change from within, especially when universities are hundreds of years old, is very, very difficult.
Interesting.
So that's what we've seen.
So that's a skunkworks model. So skunkworks is a sort of business slang for a second setting in which you empower a team to be the pirates, to do things in a different, non-conventional way. So you continue doing things the regular way, and then you have your skunkworks. Apple was very famous for doing this, competing divisions, that you then sort of let the best division win. They can duke it out. It's sort of a competitive model in some ways, and it's saying we need a sandbox for innovation that somehow pushes off the shackles of academic inertia. It's interesting. Does that work in large public universities? That's a question that I have. How do you get a skunkworksy kind of thing going when you've got a public university? Yeah, this is a difficult room, man. You actually have to go outside to go from one side to the other. So sorry about that.
It does. Just it has to come from the top. The leadership has to be completely on board.
Okay, are there any bottom-up models that also help us out here? Do we see innovations bubbling up? I mean, what do you see at UNAM, Melchor? Do you see examples in different parts of this vast university doing different things?
Yes, of course, because we have so many different campus and faculties and careers there. There are always these innovations popping up all over the place. But I think that it's very difficult to plan ahead every year. This year we will have so many patents or new inventions, etc. There's a lot of serendipity. There's a lot of suddenly the things, the stars align themselves, and somebody has ideas in the precise. They're in the right place and the right moment. But from a systems point of view, well, there are also many paradigms among the systems people. You see, so it's. If, for example, you use the complex adaptive systems model, it's you just have to let people do things and promote the interactions among people from different disciplines, and then things emerge. But it's not easy. Because you have these cycles of power where every year these deans and the presidents of the university have to do these formal reports where everything has, and we still have the same outcomes. publications in peer-reviewed journals in English, which is incredibly difficult for the usual, for example, Mexican academic scholars.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's very important also to combine both, so the bottom-up and the top-down. And when you combine both and you have a plan, maybe it's easier to go there because there's this combination of what teachers are doing in their own class and one from the top they are fostering.
So would-be academic innovators had better be scrappy and ready to use the moment, but also connect with the power structure, the stakeholders, and strike when the iron is hot, when there's a moment that you can possibly scale up. But I think at the operational level, one of the huge challenges is to keep documenting your work and figuring out what you're learning and tell those failure stories so that you're ready to also push for going up a level when it's feasible to do that. It seems, it's how we get there, what the pathway is I think a massive challenge we haven't tackled head on because we have so many different views from the different parts of the whole system. But even meetings like this help us get going. You know, I've read about Minerva, but I haven't been able to learn a ton about it, so now I have a chance to learn more. And likewise, I really think it's important to listen to other folks in the room, hunt them down, build those side conversations, but also meetings like this where we at least begin to lay out some of the issues, concerns, considerations. Take a page where it's helpful out of MIT's book. Come to the JWEL website and see what you can learn when we can share much more because there's a lot under the hood that's not visible. But we have, for instance, workshops on things like building university-industry relationships and ecosystems. Or what does co-design mean for institutions of higher education, and where do we go with that? What are the models of governance that we can borrow from that maybe have very different pictures about how to ensure that a department or a school or a unit in a university is speaking to societal needs? We recently did a full week looking at future studies inspired by I think it is OECD had a really interesting kind of look ahead into painting the future of education, and we built on that to then really explore what are different ways to engage in future studies inside of higher education, including looking at both scenarios, but also these sort of constructive approaches like the MIT task force I mentioned at the beginning. So the JWEL website and other resources we can link you to from MIT is one thing, but that's certainly not enough. And I would like to hear any thoughts you have on how we can learn about I guess what's working and what's not in the journey to digital transformation. How do we should we have a failure of digitalization meeting every year? You know, the Engineers Without Borders very famously created a fail conference every year, and they gave out a prize for the best failure story in trying to take engineering to new places and push for solutions of new problems. Do we want to have a fail conference? I don't know. How do we get a little more nitty-gritty on what works and what doesn't, and get away from these just so stories where things kind of turn out into the, Panglossian world of the best outcome you can imagine? Vijay, I don't know if you have a thought to add here.
Very quickly, I will say, this is wonderful. I think in terms of the pathways, you touched on it, and I'm going to channel you for a second because you emphasize this evidence at every stage. Hello?
Yeah, we're fine. Keep going. We're listening.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. No, because suddenly, and I think that is so to show compelling value, and I think that is critical. I do believe that in order to do this, one of the things that we have today at our disposal is low latency. We use words like fail fast in our thing. So we do have the opportunity to incentivize and experiment, quickly study, but sharing the evidence and then making changes is much more feasible now without long-term damage, because we are coming out of a world where everything had very high latency, the time between experiments, sharing, and making changes. So I think we can benefit from the low latency world for experimentation that we have in terms of educational experimentation too. So I come from a world of innovation diffusion. So, Melchior was pointing out, in academic institutions, all kinds of institutions, our faculty are constantly innovating. And we have to, that's 1,000 flowers blooming model. We have to have a mechanism, I think, for identifying which of these are significant strains and then cultivating the readiness conditions for the strains to go. And here is where I think connecting it to an earlier point that you made, and this is something that we do in JWEL a lot, which is not just thinking about the front end of innovation, but recognizing that it's a systemic problem. Not just, you talked about institutional systems, but which has to do even with what are the new kinds of organizational constructs that are needed, open learning is an example, in order to scaffold and support innovative practices as we adopt them. Otherwise, these wonderful ideas live only within a faculty, a department, and institution. So that's the thing. And we can, I believe, and again, I know I echo you here, that the ecosystem has a very important role in supporting that transition.
And this is the gift that collaboration brings. It's very, if you come, I come from a place that has a small number of students, right? A few thousand graduate every year. And that has a perch that is, internally, I don't think people would say this, but externally it's pretty well-funded, very visible, very privileged. And we're aware of our threats and we're aware of all the work that's to be done. And yet, what we do, there's no guarantee, we need to take on the work of taking any idea that seems good, whether it's coming from MIT or coming from anywhere, and then figuring out how it works elsewhere or at scale or in reality. And that's why I want this conversation to keep going. It's not just, oh, here you go, some stuff from MIT, you're welcome. Instead, we have to redesign this as a true back and forth conversation where I really get to learn from Melchior, from Pastor, from anyone else who we get to collaborate with over the long haul, because, man, imagine 350,000 students you're responsible for. Imagine 41,000 faculty and what that means to bring them along. There's a huge amount to learn. So JWEL's committed to trying to really dig into the learning coming from all fronts and find ways to take seriously the one-off to implementation challenge, which too often gets set aside as not the fun stuff. Innovation is the ideation and the first example. The rest of it is just execution. Time to make just execution the real work. Time to take seriously how things affect real people, real faculty, real students, real non-traditional learners. Maybe time to tell some failure stories. Time to also map out the different pathways that different institutions and systems have taken so that we understand there are maybe different journeys, or maybe some journeys have backed us into some dead ends that are hard to break out of. And there may be right now in the world some real challenges around data that we have to fight to actually break down the disutilities that exist. We may have to consciously, and clearly when it comes to things like access to internet resources, what are we talking about with digital disruption if we don't put that on the table? So, as well as access to the beautiful end products that come out of world-class research. Those have to become concerns. How to get in the room, the virtual room or the real room to start with. And if we use the room to make great stuff, how do we ensure it reaches the world? Really interesting questions. Any other thoughts or comments? It's that work of sort of stitching together the day's conversations always makes me realize more often comes afterwards, because you kind of have to percolate on the ideas. Yeah, go for it.
Maybe if I can add, maybe it's also very interesting to learn how to scale everything up within the institution.
Yeah.
And here, I think we can find also some common issues, like standardization, no? For instance.
Yeah.
So how do you go from innovation to something standard within the institution? And maybe here, I think the GWEL can also help us all together in order to find
Indeed.
those pathways. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Okay. And in a little while, I'm going to also, I've put together some more own personal thoughts on how MIT in particular has tried to use its openness as a route to vibrancy. So I want to, that's a little one of those head talks that's coming later on today. So I please invite you to that. But also, can we show the slides? I just want to give you my URL. I mean, my email address. So these are all the themes we foreshadowed that we touched on. But take down this email address, and if you email me, I or one of my team members will reply, and we can find a time to meet and talk. That's why I came here. So I'm very glad, and I'm very thankful to be put on the schedule early on, because we want to really continue the conversation. All right. Thank you all very much. Thank you in particular to my colleagues who, and we can put Vijay back on, who agreed to be co-called. So thank you. The privilege of being a faculty member. Oh, I don't like to see myself, but it's all over.
Thank you very much.
We can turn off all the cameras. Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to join the conversation. And let me also extend Anjali's invitation to continue the conversation.
Thank you. Go disrupt properly, sensibly, effectively. All right, thanks, folks. Thank you. Thank you.